is David Grega, who is our technical product specialist. He's going to be presenting the webinar this morning. We're going to talk about PCI compliance and why you should care. Let's go ahead and get started. I'll go ahead and turn this over to David. He's going to talk to you real quick and go over just quickly how you can ask questions.
Sure. Basically, today's webinar is mostly an intro to PCI compliance. This is kind of a one-on-one type of webinar to get you familiar with what is PCI compliance. If you have any questions at any time during this webinar, as some of you have already discovered, you can just go to the right-hand side of your screen. There's a question section, and you can go ahead and type your question there. And we're going to address the questions during the Q&A session that follows today's presentation. And if you cannot stay for the entirety of today's presentation, that is perfectly fine. You can always email your questions to sales@cpanel.net. And we'll also try to have a video of this up within a week on www.cpanel.tv. So cpanel.tv is where you can find all our videos. So as Mario said, my name is David Grega. I am a technical product specialist here at cPanel. And today we're going to be talking about PCI. Now, before we get into the realm of PCI compliance, or the term that most people refer to as PCI compliance, is figure out what PCI is. PCI is actually an abbreviation standing for Payment Card Industry. So the payment card industry is basically called PCI. So what is the payment card industry? Well, the easiest way to think about it is anything that's plastic. So if it's a credit card, a debit card, an ATM card, a check card, those plastic cards are essentially used for payment, so they're called payment cards collectively. So this would be your MasterCard, your Visa, your American Express, Discover, anything that has a number, it's on a piece of plastic. Now, if you just have the traditional PayPal account that doesn't have any kind of payment card associated with it, PayPal itself is not, a payment card, so that's not tied into this whole payment card industry standards compliance here. So when most people talk about PCI compliance, what they're really talking about is compliance with the payment card industry's data security standard. So data security standards abbreviated DSS. So this can be called PCI DSS compliance. But you'll hear it very commonly referred to by its shorthand PCI compliance. Now, if you're very interested in the technical details of PCI, the data security standard, you can go to PCIsecuritystandards.org, and they can provide you with all the information you ever wanted to know about PCI compliance and all that on a very technical level. But what exactly is PCI compliance? A lot of these discussions I hear that try to introduce the concept of PCI compliance talk to you as if you're a merchant. And we understand that while that might be one of the roles you have as a hosting company or as a hosting customer, you're basically worried about your web hosting. So what is this whole PCI compliance thing about anyway? So PCI compliance is about a minimum set of security standards. So it's designed to clean up bad data security practices that were practiced among merchants. They might have stored payment card information in plain text and all that stuff. It's a lot of bad things used to happen with payment card processing. Now, this is a minimum standard. This is just kind of a step towards a hardened server, but this is not a substitute for proper server hardening. So you can kind of think of this as a minimum set of standards that's really good to adhere to, but you should definitely be doing more than this, if you're worried about the security and hardening of your server. So PCI compliance is not a substitute or a guideline for overall server security, but it's a great starting point. And let's rehash. Why does the data security standards exist? Well, online merchants used to have very insecure practices, and there was no incentive for these merchants to abandon those insecure practices in the past. So they would store payment card information, even if that information would never be needed again. They'd be asking for this information over an unencrypted, plain text HTTP connection, which is a bad idea because everybody can see that floating through the network. And some people would even go through the practice of storing it in a plain text file, just storing the obscure location that, well, unless you knew the location, obviously you wouldn't have access to it, or so they think. So they were relying on security by obscurity, and yeah, that was exploited quite a few times in the early days of e-commerce. So that's why there's these data security standards now by the PCI organization. So who needs PCI compliance? Well, if you're handling payment card information like credit cards or debit cards or check cards or ATM cards, yes, you're probably going to need PCI compliance of some sort. Or if you have a merchant account with a credit card processor, yeah, you're probably going to need PCI compliance as well. Basically, if you're the one that touches those numbers, the payment card numbers, then yes. Now, if you have something like a shopping cart set up on your site, like a PayPal or Google Checkout type of scenario where it's like click here to check out, and the person punches their numbers into a form that's over on PayPal's site, well, then you don't need PCI compliance because all that information, all that sensitive payment card information is being handled by PayPal. You never see it. So as a result of you never knowing this information, or never acquiring this information, you do not need PCI compliance, essentially. And also, if you're not intending to do any sort of e-commerce or credit card processing or anything of that nature, like you're just running a blog, then you technically do not need to be PCI compliant.
David, what about hosting providers that, webmasters that are setting up shopping carts for clients? Should their customers be concerned about PCI compliance?
Yeah, that is something to be concerned about, especially depending on how the shopping cart is set up. So if your shopping cart is set up like, say, you got PayPal shopping cart, okay, you don't need to worry about PCI compliance. But if you're doing something with like a merchant account where this shopping cart ties into some sort of credit card processing, and that website that you are building is handling or receiving credit card information or payment card information, then yes, you do need to be concerned about PCI compliance.
Thanks. And Darren, I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to email us to sales@cpanel.net.
So if you're going into the realm of e-commerce, how does PCI compliance help you? Well, research from our associates over at McAfee indicate that sites that advocate that they are PCI DSS compliant experience 11% more sales than those that do not advocate that they are PCI DSS compliant. And also, e-commerce continues to be a growing revenue stream. CNNmoney.com reports that online sales this past holiday season were up 5.9% from the previous year. So these are non-negligible amounts. Yes, you do want 11% more sales, and yes, this online revenue stream is growing. You want to take advantage of that, and in order to do that, you're probably going to be processing credit cards, which then translates into being PCI compliant. But how does this affect you as a hosting provider? If you're running a hosting company, how does this whole PCI compliance thing affect you? Well, PCI compliance is largely comprised of tasks that only a system administrator can handle. So things like configuring the web server properly. That's not something your customers handle. That's something that the web hosting provider handles. Also, your e-commerce customers, if you're a hosting provider, do not want to risk failing to comply. And we'll get into the whole what happens when you fail to comply later on. And also, if your customers generate more revenue as a result of advertising their PCI compliance, that means they are more likely to stay in business and thus, continue to be a source of revenue for your company, or even a source of potential increase to revenue as they continue to grow. So, what about a failure to comply? If you run an e-commerce website and you fail PCI compliance, your website's credit card processor may just stop processing payments. And if you're relying on that for your business, that can be devastating. Now, the penalties for failure vary, okay? So you really do need to talk to your individual credit card processor to talk about the penalties for failure to comply, because they do vary. And also keep in mind that the more transactions you process, the more credit cards you handle essentially, the stricter the penalties are with regards to non-compliance. So this is kind of alluded to in my previous conversation, but I figure I definitely clarify here. There are many tiers to PCI compliance. So while websites that are starting out, there are small businesses or side businesses or hobbies even, might be all the way at the bottom at tier 4 because they're only handling at most a few thousand payment card transactions every year. Some of our cPanel partners, like Software or HostGator or Bluehost, they might be transacting millions of credit cards annually, and so they would be up near the first tier, tier 1. So most people will fall between tier 2 to tier 3 and tier 4, but there's a lot of large companies out there that use cPanel software that can be considered tier 1. Now the thing to keep in mind is that the requirements do vary among the different tiers. Tier 1 is very strict. You must adhere to a lot of the stringent standards proposed by the PCI data security standards. And tier 4 is very lenient, relatively speaking. So it even depends on your payment card processor. Depending on your payment card processor, they might say, oh, you know what, it's actually okay if you're not PCI compliant because, well, it's not that big of a risk to us. But as time goes on, we're seeing more and more vendors requiring PCI compliance. So it's a good, even if you don't need it today, it's a good thing to have in the long term, just in case their credit card processor decides to change their standards. Now we have partnered with McAfee Secure to provide free PCI compliance scanning. So all you got to do is go to go.cpanel.net/free PCI. And if your servers are compliant, you will receive a certificate of compliance from McAfee. So this is free. You do get a limited number of scans each year. I believe it's 6 scans. But yeah, take advantage of it. I mean, it's something that we've done through our partnership with McAfee Secure. Make use of it. Now, this is, again, one of those perks of using cPanel. We establish partnerships throughout the industry so that we can provide services like this to you. So as a hosting provider, how should you, pursue PCI compliance? What should be your viewpoint on this? Well, you might want to pursue PCI compliance yourself, even if your company is not handling any kind of transactions on that server. You might want to make the server PCI compliant and let your customers know that once it has been certified as compliant. Because if your customers know that they are PCI compliant, they're not going to go out and try to get their own scans and then submit tickets about this thing or that thing that they don't understand in their compliance report. And it will also help deter, and this is the one thing I hear a lot from system administrators, it's really nice to let your customers know you're PCI compliant, because when a PCI scan starts happening and they're starting to probe for things, you really don't want to have those false alarms in your firewall. It's PCI compliance scans can be intense, and the average firewall administrator might get a little bit nervous when this is going on. So you might want to pursue this yourself to just avoid all of these issues. Be very proactive about this on behalf of your customers. And also keep in mind, if you're just offering shared hosting on a particular server, they are probably going to be, in that tier 4 that, maybe doing a few thousand transactions a year tier. So one thing to keep in mind when you get reports from PCI scans, a few things to keep in mind. The main thing you want to be familiar with is a practice known as backporting. So backporting is the practice of taking a fix that's been introduced in a new version of software and applying it to older versions of that software. So this is something that is very widely embraced by CentOS at Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Sometimes we do it as well here with cPanel and WHM. But this is most predominantly experienced with the software supplied by CentOS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So, for example, if you're running a contemporary CentOS or a Red Hat server, you're probably running OpenSSL 0.9.8e, okay? And what happens is PCI compliance scans sometimes, and this is actually quite often, they'll just look for the version of that software that is running, and then they look in their databases like, well, this version of the software had this vulnerability, and that vulnerability is severe enough for us to say this server cannot be certified. Well, what happens is they're just looking at the version number. They're not actually probing for the actual vulnerability. And what happens with CentOS is, even though they use older versions of software, such as 0.9.8, of OpenSSL, they might have taken a fix from OpenSSL 1.0 and put it back into 0.9.8e. And the thing to keep in mind is, you're going to have to be, a lot of times you will have to go to your provider and be like, hey, I use CentOS. What they do is backporting, and here's the information of, here's the CVE, here is your reference number. CVE is basically a reference number for exploits, essentially. And it's like, okay, here's the number of this exploit that you said I'm vulnerable to. Here's the documentation that says I am not vulnerable to this exploit on my server. Can you please, correct the scan for me and certify my server? And if you want to know more about this particular topic, you can go to go.cpanel.net/PCI OpenSSL. It's kind of rare that we do backports ourselves. We do prefer to try to push out newer versions of software, but sometimes that conflicts with our quality standards and our goal to make sure our software works very well. So sometimes we do backporting. So for example, here I got an entry from an easy Apache changelog where, okay, there was a patch, that came out in a future version of PHP 5.2, but we decided to incorporate it into PHP 5.2.15. And you can also refer your PCI compliance scanner people over to our changelog to say, hey, this is the bug that you said we were vulnerable to. Here's proof that this has actually been fixed on our particular server. And if you want to find any of the changelogs for cPanel products, just go to go.cpanel.net/changelog. So common pitfalls with PCI compliance scanning, the false positives like we were talking about with backporting. So again, they're looking at versions and not actually probing for actual vulnerabilities. And another thing is, a lot of PCI scanners, if you have mod front page enabled, so if you got front page extensions still enabled on your server, which by the way we still support, they may say, well, this such and such thing is not properly hardened, it's not secure, and they're just completely not aware of what cPanel does to harden front page extensions on cPanel and WHM. And you can always refer them over to our website for this at go.cpanel.net/PCI info. And this isn't just a Linux issue. If you're using eCommerce, keep in mind that some server configuration may be required on your part. So Microsoft Windows Server 2008, it ships with SSL 2.0 support by default. SSL 2.0 is widely considered to have weak security, and most people aren't SSL 3.0 anyway. Most browsers support it. So you probably want to reconfigure your IIS server to disable SSL 2 and enable SSL 3. Now, if you're looking for a more sysadmin technical resource, you can go to cpanel.tv and view our other videos. They are much more technical in nature, and this will help you with the more technical side of PCI compliance. All right, that wraps up today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and answer your questions now.